Hello, everyone. My name is Clinton Johnson, and I use he, him, and his pronouns. I lead Esri's Racial Equity Unified team, overseeing efforts to provide geospatial resources to help individuals and organizations advance racial equity and social justice. I'm excited to welcome you to another part of this conversation about racial equity and social justice, and in this case, GIS for Equity and Social Justice, a special interest group meeting, or SIG. Just a brief note of caution here. Speakers in this session will talk about issues of racism, which may include descriptions of bias, bigotry, and hate. Solving problems begins with defining those problems. Therefore, real and sometimes very raw conversations about these issues are necessary. As I said, this is a part of a broader conversation that began actually with some earlier sessions today, but one of those sessions was using GIS to operationalize racial equity and social justice in the broader fabric of conversations around diversity and belonging and racial equity and social justice. There are many SIGs today. There's been Women in GIS, our conversations about racial equity and social justice, one of which is now. We just heard from folks in supporting Latinx communities in GIS. Most of these conversations have at their center racial equity and social justice. So the agenda for this particular conversation, we're going to start with land acknowledgements. Then in a moment, I'll introduce you to our featured speakers. Then we'll talk about efforts to foster conversations about race, equity, and social justice. Then we'll talk about pro-equity, anti-racism efforts that are underway in the GIS community as we speak. Next, one of our featured speakers will share one of the projects that they've been working on to address racist street names in Kern County. And finally, we'll have a moderated discussion, a question and answer session, where we invite each of you to begin sharing your questions in the Q&A section, some of which we'll get throughout the conference, but we definitely want to be able to make time to address some of your questions at the end. So again, add them all along the way. So to start, we just want to acknowledge that all of us are on stolen land. I happen to be coming from the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation lands in a place that we call Philadelphia, PA. Some of us are coming from territory of the Yokuts people in a space that we call San Joaquin Valley in Central California. And some of us are coming from the Duwamish tribes lands in Seattle, in a place that we call today Seattle, Washington. I'll invite Nicole Franklin on to talk more about this.
So I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional lands of the first people, indigenous people all around the world. I'm in Seattle, so I honor the Duwamish people, past, present, and future. And we must honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be information and a call to action. And so land acknowledgements are necessary, but also should include action. And so I would like to talk today just shortly on the actions that I take. And in the Duwamish tribe, we're able to pay tithes or rent to the Duwamish, and I pay a portion of my earnings to the Duwamish tribe. And I think that we should all think about not just completing land acknowledgements in words, but what actions can we take to truly honor the indigenous people, past, present, and future. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Nicole. And today I'm joined by three champions for racial justice. You've just heard from Nicole Franklin. These folks have worked on important projects to increase equity in communities around the country. And they've also worked on building community within the GIS community and across to promote the use of GIS as a critical component in understanding inequities and addressing and advancing racial justice. So Nicole Franklin is the Chief Pro-Equity and Anti-Racism Officer at Enhanced Interactions. Sophia Garcia works at Redistricting Partners as the Director of GIS and Outreach. And Jesus Garcia is a research associate under the Citizen Science Project at the California State University, Bakersfield. Jesus has also worked as a demographic statistician at the U.S. Census, where he served in the Division of Population Division. The presentation that I mentioned earlier about the project helping folks in Kern County address racist street names. That'll be presented by Jesus, sorry. His project uses GIS to help address this important racial injustice. And before I hand things over to our featured speakers, I want to talk a little bit about how GIS can be used as a framework for racial justice. So Esri provides comprehensive guidance and resources to help individuals and organizations use GIS as a framework for racial justice, the first component of which helps address one of the most compelling challenges of our time: how to apply a robust intersectional racial equity lens to identify inequities in community circumstances and outcomes. Behind all of this is racial equity root cause analysis. These best practices recognize that inequities in outcomes, community conditions, and community assets flow from decisions and practices further upstream. The goal of this methodology is twofold: to assess and address unhealthy racial equity streams, but also to identify, uplift, and amplify those decisions and practices that lead to community assets that drive positive outcomes. And this model was heavily influenced by the work of King County, Washington, and the work of the organization called Race Forward. And in this model, outcomes are the indicators of how people fare. That is to say, how individuals, families, and communities fare socially and economically. And outcomes include things like educational attainment and school nutrition, prevalence and severity of chronic disease. Many of the social and economic results, including mental health and well-being, and the kinds of biases that people might experience when living in a place where there are racist street names all around you, denigrating who you are as a person to you and to those around you. Community assets and conditions are the circumstances that surround individuals, families, and communities where they live, work, play, and travel. And they include community conditions like access to quality healthcare, to education, to parks and recreation, housing and environmental conditions, and many other conditions across a wide range of concerns. And like I said, that includes exposure to racist monuments, street names, and school names. And decisions and practices are policies, programs, systems, messaging, and budget decisions that influence the circumstances surrounding individuals, families, and communities, impacting how they fare. And these include historic and contemporary practices and decisions by governments, businesses, other institutions like educational institutions, communities themselves, and they include decisions and practices like those associated with naming and maintaining street names and street signs, something that cities and counties do all the time. Decisions and practices may create or sometimes sustain structural racism or other forms of discrimination, bias against or for people based on class, gender, or other social groupings, inequitable distributions of resources or power, or intergenerational inequities, meaning any combination of the above impacting multiple generations of families and communities over time. And when we think about those decisions and practices in the case of Kern County and other cities across the country that are dealing with racist monuments, racist street names, schools that are named after people whose mission in life and some of their victories in life have had racism at their center. Well, there is a degree to which the decisions that do not address those issues are sustaining those racist practices. So this model helps us to understand and address the root causes of racial inequities and including racial injustice. It also supports and enables us to acknowledge and adopt best practices for racial equity and social justice. And one of those best practices is normalizing conversations about addressing racial equity. Many of you in the audience are likely problem solvers by trade. As we all know, articulating issues is a critical aspect of any problem-solving effort. So I'm going to hand things over to Sofia Garcia to talk about efforts to foster conversations about racial equity and social justice in GIS.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are around the world. I know we're in a virtual space. My name is Sofia Garcia. I work at Redistricting Partners, a redistricting firm based in California, as their community outreach director. But I came into this space, and we can go to the next slide. came into this space as a woman of color, as a Latina, as someone who had a father. Just full disclosure, Jesus is my dad, and it's a wonderful, weird, kind of exciting thing to be presenting with him on this stage and acknowledging just like the work that goes into this is right now. I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the folks here are my mentors, are my friends, are people I have met at conferences, and people who have felt similar to me of not feeling like GIS or the GIS industry had a space for people of color, had a space to talk about racism, to talk about our own lived experiences, and to talk about how we want to use this wonderful tool of GIS to advance our own communities. So my portion will be a little bit about the history and acknowledgement of people, acknowledging that Esri does have this wonderful platform, but it's also made up of folks. And so we just go back to the next slide. I want to acknowledge Dolores Huerta and Jack Dangerman, who are two icons in their own right. Dolores, if you don't know her, you should Google her. There's a movie about her, a foundation about her. Jack, as we all know, is our GIS person who wants us to map the world, and Dolores wants to organize the world. So back in 2016, these two folks who have championed their own causes met and sort of started to spur what we have today. Dolores and Jack's being able to sit across from them was a historic moment, to be able to see these two folks who have dedicated their whole lives to this cause, and then to come together and see how wonderful this work could be if we brought organizing our communities and the power of GIS together. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So that meeting spurred having a specific department at the Dolores Huerta Foundation. And the Dolores Huerta Foundation is a nonprofit, a social justice nonprofit. So be able to have the access to Esri software is a testament to Esri, is a testament to making this software accessible to nonprofits and communities that would not be able to afford it otherwise. But also just the combining and allowing this nonprofit to utilize this technology in their organizing space helps spur a redistricting movement. So I also want to say this is a redistricting year. GIS has been in the spotlight the past 2 years, one because of COVID-19. All of us are very familiar with that Johns Hopkins dashboard, and last year also because of the census, and then again this year because of redistricting. So we're in a really unique space where all of us as GIS folks, people who have not done mapping or community organizing, are becoming more familiar with our work. And the nonprofit helped start the work of redistricting in California to bring it to back to what the basic of redistricting is, the basic of democracy, and allowing for all of these transactions to happen in public. Clinton said earlier about the framework and how some of our institutions are set up to keep certain people in power and to not have community voices be heard, and allowing again for the access of this technology, but specifically with a community organization that has a grassroots base to use that and move that forward has resulted in a new California state law and more conversation around redistricting across the country. And we'll go to the next slide. My thing is a lot of photos because I want you guys to see folks. I know we haven't seen people in person for 2 years. So the photo on the bottom is a group photo that we all took at the first annual Equity, Social Justice Special Interest Group in 2019. Clinton is there, Margot is there. I think almost everyone on this call is in that photo. And I just want to acknowledge the importance of space, and that when I first started going to the Esri conference almost 10 years ago, which is wild, there wasn't a young professionals network. There was, I think the Women in GIS was just starting. All of those wonderful SIGs that Clinton acknowledged at the beginning weren't here. And so it was the work as individuals, it was the work of customers coming forward, and also finding staff like Clinton and Margot and Clint Brown and Dave from the nonprofit section, that we all pushed to have this space and have Esri and have our community recognize that using equity and social justice as a lens to work and do GIS work is something that is valued, is something that we should be doing in our workplace, is something that is a lived experience, but is something that we can all do as our work and as our job. And so we'll go to the next slide. And we have Nicole, and the next portion as well is Nicole presenting at the Esri conference. So just having our presence there, pushing for the social justice track, putting in submissions of abstract that talk about race, that talk about community, that talk about organizing is so important. And every time that I went, I would find a new friend. I would find a new person, and we would organize within. I found Olivia because she came to the social justice group. I met Nicole in Palm Springs. I met Clinton. People kept telling Clinton and I that we had to meet. And when we met, it was just fantastic. So acknowledgement of networking is vital, and just a really wonderful space. And I really hope we can meet all of you guys in person next year. COVID and vaccines, and hopefully we all get those. And we'll go to the next slide. Also want to acknowledge that folks have been doing community GIS work for years. These are photos that I have taken throughout the years of different maps and different people, and just there's a map of the railway for the California high-speed rail in Bakersfield, and acknowledging what are the implications of going through one part of town versus another. That's a transportation issue that we deal with. Poverty, you deal with low-income areas. The map directly to the right of that is mapping out a specific dish in Japan, and referencing that we have different foods because of climate and because of culture. There's the photo of the young woman who's talking about ambassadors through technology with her tribal nations. We have one of mapping out the hashtag solidarity student 1950, which is protests that happen across the country. So we are here today because of us, because of folks, but also because there have been people who have been doing this work and mapping it and submitting it to conferences for years. And I'm excited and love taking photos and love learning about the different ways that we apply that approach that Clinton said earlier. And we'll go to the next slide. Where we are today is, again, GIS has been in the spotlight to push for talking about and normalizing these conversations have happened last year. Again, there's the John Hopkins dashboard. I took that screenshot just today. COVID is still out there. There are still people who don't have access to vaccines. There's the screenshot of Jesus's dashboard, which he'll review, the screenshot of ERISA, which Nicole will talk about. We also have all of the different special interest groups that Clinton was talking about. And we also have books today, and I really implore all of you to look at this book called Critical Race Spatial Analysis. So it takes critical race theory, which has become a very hot topic in the country today, and I wish more folks would learn about that theory, and it applies it to our work as spatial thinkers, as GIS folks. And then I wanted to acknowledge my co-founders, Olivia and Victoria, who we created an Instagram to just continue to talk about this work on another platform and to create more friendships. And that this whole presentation today is, it's like we're normalizing conversations about equity, social justice, race, and GIS, and that happens in different spaces. That happens personally, that happens organizationally, that happens through legislation. And so finding your network, finding people to talk to about creates spaces, creates conversations, creates future projects. And I think the next slide is my last one. And I also want to sort of just, this is one way that we can sustain this work if folks are asking, what can I do? How can I get involved? You can be involved in redistricting. Redistricting is happening this year and next year. And it is a perfect example of how GIS folks can be involved with community. You can get dirty. You can have conversations with your community about this work. There are a number of independent commissions across the country, but your city, your county, everyone is redistricting. And I also want folks to familiarize themselves with the concept of communities of interest and maintaining communities of interest. I did a presentation at the conference that's online. Jesus does this work. There's also just like a lot of resources out there. For our California folks, there's something called the Fair Maps Act, which I also implore folks to read, but just applying that framework, applying what Nicole and Jesus are going to talk about. This is a way that we can all be involved in our community, in a way that we can talk about maps with our family, and it also has implications for a decade. So if we're talking about structural racism, if we're talking about structure of institutions, redistricting is a really great way that we can all be involved in that, and also it only happens once a decade. So I'm just so excited to be here again with friends and family and to hear what my fellow presenters have to say. And as a reminder, you can put your Q&A in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. But reach out to us and I'll pass it on to Nicole. So thank you all.
Thank you, Sophia. My name is Nicole and I use she and her, hers as my gender pronouns. And I'm here to talk about pro-equity, anti-racism, organizational development in GIS. So how can we go beyond our anti-racist statements and really think about what do we need to do as organizations to take action and do the organizational change that's needed to do this work authentically. Next slide, please. So I always say this is one of my favorite quotes from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm always surprised at the new quotes that I know, and when I realized many of the quotes that I find very impactful, I did not get taught early in my life. But this is one of my favorites, and I am actually going to read this. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And I think this is a very timely quote. I think we have lots of folks and we're excited about that. As Sophia said, people have been doing this work for decades, centuries, right, millennium. And we're standing on our ancestors' work. I think a lot of folks, because of the recent year, have gotten into this work with love, passion, and empathy. But we want to remember that that love has to come with power, and power is action. Action is power. And so I think it's really important for us to think about how not only are we engaged, excited, aware of the initiatives that we are, but what are we actually doing? What actions are we taking as individuals and as organizations, right? Because organizations are made up of individuals, but we also need to think about our organizational change and our individual change. It is a continuous journey, and we want to make sure that we're moving along that journey together and authentically. Next slide, please. So when we think about anti-racism, pro-equity statements that have been made or anti-racism statements, we really want to make sure that's coupled with personal and organizational action. We want to think about those items and what we want to be able to do. And I've been very fortunate with lots and lots of folks in our profession to work with Urissa on their organizational journey, their pro-equity, anti-racism organizational journey. I think it's important to understand the concept of pro-equity, anti-racism. There are many things like we talk about as far as uh, basically why are we calling out anti-racism? What's pro-equity? What is pro-equity, anti-racism? These questions are flying around. What does that mean? If we're focused on anti-racism, does that mean we don't care about women or those who have different abilities? Are we not caring about the LGBTQI? The whole point of it being pro-equity means we want to be pro-equity. We care about every anti-oppression work that we want to do. We care about sexism, heterosexism, ageism, classism, nationalism. All of those things are systems of oppression that are meant to divide us. And we're intentionally created, as Clinton mentioned, to do things. People intentionally created these systems to benefit some and harm many. And even though folks might not be inventing those systems today, we really got to do the work to intentionally undo that racism, undo that oppression. And that also works through doing our organizational development work. So when there's a few just high level components of organizational development work, and that is thinking about pro-equity lines of business. And then you also have to think about your organizational lines of business. So as it relates to ERISA, the organizational lines of business are the committees and the action groups that they have. It's the conferences that they put on. It's the things that they do. Equity and social justice work is how we do what we do. So that kind of leads us to our pro-equity, anti-racist lines of business, how we do what we do. So I'm going to flip here quick just to kind of show you guys a sneak peek of this. Hopefully this works. Nope, I got the wrong screen on there. How about this? All right, let me know if you guys can see that.
You had the right screen the first time.
It was the right screen the first time?
Yeah.
Like now?
There
Okay.
you go.
Perfect. All right. So just talking through what would be pro-equity, anti-racism lines of business, it's really the things that you should think about in your organization to do pro-equity and anti-racism work. And so, you'd want to have these different lines of business in play to be able to ensure that that you can look at everything that you do, which is your core lines of business, to ensure that you're being able to make these changes in a systematic way. So you're going to want to look at your leadership, operation, and services. You might think at that in that place of doing equity impact reviews on your lines of business, getting a gap analysis and a SWOT analysis, tying that into your plans, policies, and budgets. That's your place to invest and to invest where the needs are greatest. So you're going to tie that in and be able to fill those gaps from an equity perspective with your budgets, your practices, your projects, your investment streams can fill those gaps intentionally. Your workplace. This is a lot of where our diversity and belonging work happens, right? Where we do that intentional workforce development, pipelining work, community partnerships, as Sophia talks about, reaching out there, getting with community-led solutions. Communication and education, understanding how you communicate and educate from your system. I won't go through all of these, but the whole goal of this is that there are intentional pro-equity lines of business that you want to look at every area of what your organization does and how they do it in a way that is intentional. We're really excited, as I said, to be working with ERISA. We want you guys to come join us at GIS Pro. That's where we'll be launching our hub site on that during that conference. It is going to be in person this year. So whether you can come in person or know that you can launch with us virtually, we're excited to have folks be able to come and participate. And in each of these, there will be teams that we want people to participate around the world, right? ERISA is an international organization. GIS is international, and so we want to be able to make sure that folks can come, participate, lend your strengths, and learn something new around doing pro-equity and anti-racism work by leveraging GIS technology. Let me see if I can migrate back to my Whoever can maybe go back and migrate back to the screen, back to the slides. Thank you. So as I was saying, we've been on this journey for about a year. It's very exciting, and we hope that you join us. Look, either meet us at GIS Pro October 3rd through the 6th, or look for the social media and the other links on the site for the launch of URISA's Pair Hub site. It's really URISA's pro-equity, anti-racism organizational development work, and looking for folks to lend their strengths or learn something new as we grow together. Next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Now we'll hear from Jesus Garcia to walk us through this really important project. Jesus, you may be muted. Perhaps like me, you have that extra mute button on your mic or headset.
Am I on now?
There you go.
Okay.
I think you turned it right back off.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hold it. Kidding. Go.
Well, again, thank you, Clinton, and thank you, staff at the Esri Racial Equity staff. I'd also like to thank, at this point, CSU Bakersfield for allowing me to use their technology. Of course, Dolores Huerta Foundation, which has been a great resource in getting us to this point. And on a special note, personal note, I'd like to thank Clint Brown for the support that he has provided us all during this journey. So 1 year ago, actually at about this time, I was an employee with the U.S. Census Bureau. My position as partnership specialist was to outreach to the community. However, because of the COVID, we were on mandatory federal government lockdown, which meant my connection to the folks was through email, through phone calls, or through the various Zoom calls that were only beginning at that time. It was at this time also that I was watching the events of the George Floyd killing, particularly the Black Lives Movement activities, and then especially the nationwide recall for elimination of monuments to primarily Confederate generals and the like. Here locally, I actually put on my mask and we journeyed outside and attended a Black Lives Matter event here in Bakersfield. However, thinking that I could do more, at that time, a colleague of mine submitted a social media post about a Confederate monument that was here in Kern County, Bakersfield, 1,000 miles away, literally from the heart of the Confederacy. And she had initiated a change.org to eliminate that monument. Now, that monument was in a very prominent position at the Kern County Library, and literally everybody that went from one part of the not the library, but the museum had to pass by that monument. Within a week, that monument was gone. It's now stored in the back room of the library, and I actually tried to go see it. I wasn't allowed at the time because it's been secured. That got me to thinking, however, what else do we have here in Kern? And can we go to the next slide? Here in Kern, we have places. Now, society, we all have locations. We all have places that are important to us. So, I mean, who out there of the folks out there know about Abbey Road? Never been there, but I'm sure many of you, this is an important part. Another important, actually historical route for GIS itself is the Broad Street Cholera Pump, which is the birthplace of GIS, many consider. Next slide, please. Now, some places are silly, and some places are funny. What I have here is Whittier Boulevard. And for all my gente out there that knows about cruising, you may actually be a product of a cruise. So Whittier Boulevard and the cruising culture there had a long and illustrious history. But then again, there are those very special places, and that's my favorite street in the whole wide world, which is Chumalia, a 2-block road in San Leandro, primarily made of a bunch of 2- or 3-story apartment complexes. But that's also the nickname of my grandmother for myself. So Chumalia, if anybody knows any folks in San Leandro and they have a sign they want to get rid of, please send it my way. Next slide, please. Now, some places, however, have taken on a different state. There's obviously the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the March on Selma, but then we have the events of George Floyd. What you have there is another project that I'm working on. I'm working on what's called the RASA database project. And in this project, we are analyzing the deaths at the hands of police, all 33,800 from 2002 through Mother's Day of this year. So what are we looking at here? In this slide, we have the George Floyd killing right there in the middle. You can see that. And then I have spaced out half mile spaces. So within a half mile of George Floyd's death, there are 4 other deaths that have occurred between 2002 and 2015. We have an additional 4 or 5 at a mile. We have an additional 4 or 5 after that. And then if we go beyond 2 miles of George Floyd's death, there are at least 20 individuals that have died at the hands of police. So this is not, so the death of George Floyd in that spot was not a particularly unique event. He's part of 25 or more individuals within 2 to 3 miles of that geography. This is what I'm hoping GIS to explore. Let's continue. So, as I mentioned, Kern County. Kern County has its roots in manifest destiny, white supremacy, and racism. I'm glad we're using that term. We need to normalize that as a part of Kern County's history as a way to improve. So here in Kern County, just to give you a little bit of a history, it began in Visalia. Visalia was a town, beautiful little tree-lined place. 1850s is the foundation of Visalia. Over the course of the Civil War, it became a place of refuge for both whites and blacks. However, many of the whites brought their Confederate sympathies, and in fact, the federal government had a garrison outside of Visalia for the Confederate sympathies that was there. Let's go on. No, I'm sorry, let's stay here for a little bit. So yeah, this is perfect. So however, things are beginning to change. What you're seeing here is a quote from Nicholas Veladras. It appeared in Bloom, California. It was literally a year ago that he put this very heartfelt piece about how he was a student at South High School, which has a Confederate theme, and I'll get to show you some of that. He was 14 years old, didn't know anything about history or racism, but he pinned a Confederate flag on his hat because that's what all the good guys were doing there. So racism, the Confederacy was normalized to this little Mexican-American boy when he was 14 years old. Let's go to the next slide, please. What we have here is again, a history of racial covenants against African-Americans in particular. So between 1897 through 1950, when it was banished by federal law, what you have there are the racial covenants that prevented African-Americans from being sold a house. The only difference being the Mayflower District, and that was established in 1911 as the only place that blacks could own a home within Bakersfield. The shaded area is Bakersfield as of about 1897. The quadrants are Bakersfield at about 1939. Down there in the bottom, you have another little unique place. let's go on to the next slide, please. That is the Plantation South High School neighborhood of Bakersfield. And what's unique about it, one is its name, South High School, Plantation Elementary, but in particular, the names of these streets. These were, again, as Clinton has mentioned, put there by individuals, approved by government agencies. They've now been there 50, 60 years. Where do you live? Oh, I live on Sumner and Plantation. It's just normalized. So for many, many people, this has always been there. Why do we need to change it? However, as I went and looked at the names, there are some that are obviously Confederate sympathizing, you know, Merrimacs, the Plantations, the Rebels, the Pontiacs. But there are others that that could have an affiliation. I could know it, but you know, I just have there a list. So there's much work to continue that needs to be done on there. Let's continue. If you thought that South High wasn't racist, then look at their mascots. Look at their logos. Look at the flag girls, which up until the mid 1960s had a Confederate flag as they were marching out on football games. We have a high school called North. They would have mock Civil War battles between the North and the South. We have, you know, Jody and Julie Rebel, and then actually a very unique. You see that the black gentleman on the horse. There was actually an African American, Johnny Reb. From what I understand, his life was challenging at best while he was in school among his peers, and then sadly he came to an untimely death much later in his life. Look at the original logo of South High School with the Confederate battle stars in the background. Then we have Plantation Elementary School, and it's unique about Plantation. They're the Plantation Patriots. So are we patriotic to America, or are we patriotic to the Confederacy? It's really unknown by the name. Let's continue. So again, there's pushback. Just recently, South High has eliminated their mascot. They're now the Spartans, but there was a tremendous pushback by the alumni. Always a rebel, always a rebel. However, news media and I think just the atrocity of this name caused the district to cave in. A big push was that gentleman right there, Danny Morrison. He was a local radio personality here in Kern County. He's now a nationally syndicated radio host. Danny Morrison, I recommend you look into him. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the Kern County today. Roughly 90% plus of the population is African American, 97% plus of the schools in the next. Let's go on to the next slide. So let's go to the next slide. So from my time and my passion to do something, I began this on my own. I have certain skills in data analytics and GIS, and so I pulled down the Tiger files, and from that I extracted the 18.5 million street names in the US. I found that 94 million of them, 9.4 million actually have street names, and of those street names, there are 5,827 street segments with either the names of Rebel, Merrimack, Shenandoah, Plantation, or Sumner. These are the street names within South High. So I don't have any generals or any Robert E. Lees, any of those other sorts. This presentation, this dashboard is focused on these. So next slide, please. So again, this is a distribution of the street names, and you don't have the legend, but the street names are indicated by the dots. Let's go to the next slide, please. I've brought together an aggregate of the counts. And so what we have here are counties with and without the street names that I have here in Bakersfield. And so again, you can see the concentration. The legend you can look at when you check out the dashboard. Let's go to the next slide. I've then created a spatial density analysis of these street names. And so what I have here is plantation. Now, as of learning, plantation in many places has a positive connotation. There are lots of wonderful places called plantation. I'll give you a slide later. But in this case, I made plantation what it really stands for, which was basically a concentration camp or prison for African Americans, as you can see by this icon that I found, which is a hand with a chain around it. Let's go to the next slide. We can zoom in, and once we zoom into the dashboard, I brought in American Community Survey statistics. Remember, I used to work at the census, so I know a little bit about this stuff. And so when you click on any particular county, it will come up with the counts of street names, by types, and as well as some of the statistics. This is Laroons County, Georgia. And as we can see here, 47,000 people, of which 17,000.5 are African American. Let's go on to the next slide. I have a series of bar charts by street name, by city, by county, so you can peruse at your heart's content and look at different things. Go to the next slide, please. And so here is one dashboard that's looking at Confederate streets specifically. And then, on the bottom, we have US streets by the location of Confederate streets by census region. And on the other side, I have Confederate street name called Plantation, again, by that specific census geography. We have the top counties, cities, or places. Let's go on to the next slide. As I mentioned, Plantation is a nice place to live if you're not an African American. These are just a selection of the plantation streets that exist around the country. There are, a few rundown other places of more moderate income, but as a whole, I found these to be a typical view of what a plantation would be like. Let me share my screen a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to now share. So let's go. Can you see my screen? This is a CSUB link. So what again, here is the dashboard that I've created. And right now it's zoomed in to a certain portion. So let's, I've gone through this. So let me go into the actual map. And so here at the map, I have an overlay of the Confederacy. And then the selected street names come up here. Here's obviously the legend. Click on here. So let's turn off the streets. Let's turn off the things, and let's just focus on one street. And here's Plantation. Here's a heat map of Plantation. The street counts, and maybe the county sums. And so right away, we have the ability to zoom in. And so from here, we can go to some particular place. So here's, let me turn off the county, sorry. Click on this location here, and up pops obviously some data about that place. Oh, let me get this out of the way. So here's the census statistics about that community, the adjacent counties, and there's 43 features being the names that I have that are within that community. So I think I've got most of the streets, down to the particular locations. And then let's go here and do the counties. Interestingly, I also found that there were some counties that did not have Confederate. So here, for instance, are pockets of counties that even in the South may or may not have had a Confederate street name at this point. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have Confederate street names at all. It's just that the street names that I'm focusing on here, Rebel, Shenandoah, Merrimack, and the like, are not included. Okay. So Clinton, you want to take us back? Let me stop sharing. Okay, so we're back. These street names are hiding in plain sight. This is a street name, Prissy. I found in a community called Florence, South Carolina. And so this is, I guess, where I can end my presentation. But I think this is where the folks that are out there listening can come and address the issues. Where are the other street names within your community to that we can modify? So with that, I'll end my presentation. And Clinton, I know you have, Clint, you want to take over?
Thanks, Jesus. Actually, I think someone else is helping us with the moderated questions.
Yes, that would be me. Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Lunsford, and I work with Sophia at Spatial Commons. And I'm also a transportation planner in my professional day job, but this is always fun to do. So we're going to just start with the first question. It's actually for Jesus, and it got 39 votes in the Q&A. So here we go. Is there a racist street, school, or monument name directory anywhere that we can use to cross-reference? Jesus, take it away.
Well, you can find all the street names on the Tiger files off the Census Bureau. Download them for free. I use a software called SAS to process the data and extract every combination of the above. But that's what I use. So I could at least assist in that. Now, as far as parks, school, and others, you'll have to do other resource. Now, as far as schools are concerned, there's various lists at the U.S. Department of Education. And so if it doesn't exist, I believe we have some pretty smart folks out there that can probably generate a lot of these files. But there's lots of information available. I can assist in that, but there's a lot of bright folks out there that I'm sure can look at it.
Well, thanks for answering that one, Jesus. We got a couple of Esri related questions, and I was thinking Clinton would be a good person to answer these since we still have a bit of time. So there are two questions, and I'll read them both because I think that Clinton could probably answer both of them at the same time. What are the best posted layers to show all aspects of racial inequity and social vulnerability in the United States, and specifically California? They said that they already know about the CDC social vulnerability data set, but are there more sources that are as reputable or even better? And then one person asked on the plans of Esri to start highlighting this topic on a more global scale, perhaps engage speakers from various countries. So if you could go for that.
Okay. I am that person who says that we can't use one index to understand all inequity in any one place. The social vulnerability index, as an example, was one built for a specific purpose. And it probably works really well for that purpose, and it was built at a certain time, and I think it gets updated, but it's around a specific purpose. We always encourage people to build indices around the topics that matter in the geographies that matter at the locale, like the level of geographic granularity that matters. There are a ton of data coming from the American Community Survey that exists in the Living Atlas that you can take advantage of. You can check out the Racial Equity Hub or the Racial Equity and Social Justice Hub. And there's a section on data. There are also sections where you can find examples of how other folks have used data in different ways to build their own sense of what either well-being looks like, health-wise, education-wise, economic wise or other, what vulnerability looks like, what risk looks like, what inequity looks like. And there's just so many different ways that people can assess and analyze and inequities. And while there are some topics that you can think of as sort of a cross-cutting across the nation, it's really at the local level that you have to be concerned. And at that local level, there may be understandings of which racial groups, all the way down to the subgroup level, at the intersections of things like gender, sexual orientation, age, ability, all these things, all these factors are relevant. And there's lots of data that you can use to try to get at those intersections. You're also going to come into spaces and times where you need to gather more information or reach out to other partners and ask them to share some of their data. So that's always going to be important. Now, in the international context, and I think of international as all countries, not just outside of the US, conversations about things that we sort of think of in a US framing as racial equity and social justice take place in a number of different ways. In some contexts, you'll hear sustainable development or inclusive development. Sometimes folks are focused on inequalities. Some sort of racialized groups are racialized based on tribe, country of origin, immigration status, religion, so many different factors, and all of those intersect with lots of other characteristics that I've described before. And we are, after the user conference, we're going to be spending a lot of time and effort to build out the racial equity portion of the Esri website, to share a broader set of stories about topics of concern, not just in the US, but around the world. We're going to work to cover many more intersections of issues. Someone asked in a previous session about people with disabilities. All of that is in context for us, as Nicole described, pro-equity and anti-racism. We use a very similar lens as we're building out content. And we would very much enjoy bringing together people from different parts of the world to talk about how this looks in terms of how it looks differently in different places, and what's common, so we can exchange patterns of techniques to understand and approaches to resolve issues.
Thanks for answering that, Clinton. And it sounds like Nicole actually wants to add something to that.
Yeah, I would just say it's really important for us to ask the questions that we need to ask for equity and social justice. And just like systems were created, data collection was also created. And so oftentimes we might not have the data set to do the analysis that we need to do. And we really need to move to start creating and collecting those data sets that we need to do the analysis of equity and social justice. And then so one is the data set and the data, that you're getting. And the other one is really doing your analysis around understanding where the needs are greatest and investing where the needs are greatest and thinking over space and time. And that's why GIS is such a great tool to do this spatial analysis. Equity is a spatial analysis. And so being able to think about that. So I would just add that in, there's obviously different indexes, but I think oftentimes in this work, there is data that's not being collected. And we need to start collecting that as an action.
So we don't have much time left, and we wanted to make sure we were sharing resources with all of you. So you can check out the Esri nonprofit program if you're a nonprofit, or if you know of any that could benefit. Who can't? Could benefit from GIS. There's a racial equity hub that you should check out. There's also a racial equity website upon which you can find that if you're working on a racial equity related challenge, then you can tap into software really quickly, at no initial cost, and get engaged with GIS Core to help you tackle those issues. And you can get in contact with folks at the redistricting partners to engage in some of the work that Sophia is doing. You can also, I believe we have some contact information. You can get in contact with our great speakers today using these links, and I will leave them up on the screen for folks who maybe will take screenshots and whatnot. Thanks everyone for joining this conversation. Thanks so much to our amazing speakers for contributing to this work, to GIS in this way, to this movement as Sophia was describing. And thanks everybody for showing up to the conversation. Please check out the rest of the conversations today.